Okay, everybody, shalom. It's January 31st today. We are talking about Parasha Terumah, which is an amazing Parsha. It's a great Parsha. Um, and already from the beginning of this Parsha, we'll recognize that we're entering a new zone, despite the fact that we're still located at Mount Sinai. And very important to understand that our story is continuing, as we just said prior to this class, that Moses, at the end of last week's Parsha, is up on the mountain. And the Parsha told us at the end, he's going to stay there for 40 days and 40 nights. And it's during that time that these instructions are now being given, at least as we read the Torah consecutively. Of course, there are many theories, both from traditional commentaries and modern scholars as to how these pieces come together. But reading the Torah consecutively, as we do in the synagogue, we ended up with Mount Sinai. We stayed up there, and Moses is there, and now we're getting these rules, instructions. As we said, it's like how the place, the sanctuary, is going to be built, and what's that? What are the major features of that? Um, and that, I think, poses for us some very, very important and basic questions, which is, what is this? What's going on here? How do we understand this? And for that, we need to just recover some ideas of the idea of the word kadosh. Okay, so we're going to start off with this. The main theme of the parsha, as is often stated, is expressed in this verse: "Vasu li mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham." Let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell among them. And already you get the kind of tension here the Torah is making, which is that the word mikdash makes us think about, since we've learned it many times, of a structure, a building, that I may dwell among them and not among it, not in it. That the sanctuary itself is not a vehicle for God to dwell in, as much as a vehicle for God to dwell among the people. And as we've been saying, that if the vision of the mountain and the vision of the burning bush is that God, who is a consuming fire, can actually coexist with the people, provided that people live with righteousness and proper behavior, then the idea that you would be taking the God's presence and having that animate the people, I think is really the culmination here. So what we're seeing in textual terms is a highly symbolic language. It's almost as if saying, and I used this analogy last time, you take the greatest power that we know of, a nuclear reactor, and you find a way to control that the nuclear core, right? And you build a reactor, and then you set the reactor in the middle of your community. I mean, we're gonna, one day, maybe not soon, that's what'll happen. Though people will be able to power their homes from, I don't know, a rock, because you'll have the technology to contain the nuclear reaction and make it safe within your home. I don't think that's we're near that, but you get the point. The point is that we're taking that which is the most powerful in the element in the universe, God, and say, okay, it's going to be here. So people are going to relate to it, and they're going to be able to have a sense of proximity to that in a very real sense, but also in a very symbolic sense. But we really have to go back to the word mikdash and understand what kadosh is and what kadosh isn't. And because that word really animates so much of Judaism, I think it's really important to go back to understanding it. Okay, what is Kedusha? Well, it's a difficult word, a concept in our secular world, right? We the same way that, and I have the analogy here, we understand gravity today very different from the way Aristotle did, very different from the way Plato did, very different from the way, people even like Galileo did. After Newton, uh, gravity was understood as a force between objects. After Einstein, it's much more complicated than that. Such the point that it's gravity exerts a force even on light. Okay, that idea that gravity can even bend light is something that would have amazed Newton for sure. But the point is that basic concepts in rooted in their time mean something different, obviously, than what they do today. Today, we since we live in a secular world, we really don't have the experience of holy in the same way that our ancestors did. And we certainly don't have the experience of awe. I think that is one of the major um, disruptions of the modern era, which has basically uprooted this whole experience from human experience. We come to these parts of human experiences uh, very differently. So I'm using that as an analogy. Kedusha, kadosh, is something different than what it does. It's usually translated as sacred and holy. Sacred from the Latin sacrum, which is dedicated, and holy from the German heilig, which is whole. So these are not the biblical ideas of holiness. The biblical idea of kadosh is something different. Will you go an excursion right now on the idea of kadosh? It's very interesting that nowhere in the Bible is an individual uh, called Kadosh. You would have expected maybe Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses himself to be considered as Kadosh, but they're not. Noah, who is our first interesting figure, is Anish Tzaddik. He is righteous, okay? He is not Kadosh. He is Tzaddik. He's righteous. That ought to tell you something, that the Bible, in terms of human behavior and human characteristics, is really concerned with righteous behavior as opposed to holy behavior. All right, it does want the people to be holy, as of course you know, but righteousness is the characterization. Abraham is not called holy, but Abraham is unique because God knows him. Ki yadativ. Isaac is not holy, but Isaac is interesting because God says, I will be with you. So what makes these characters distinct is that there's a relationship between them and God. Okay, Abraham is exceptional in that he is a person who has he's loyal and he's able to, he's a kind of model of a certain way of behavior. Yaakov also, Anochi imach, I am with you. Moses is Ish Elohim, a man of God, whatever that means. Okay, that's as best as we will get. But he's not called Kadosh. Kalev is called Avdi, another example. All right, my servant. Samuel, later on in the book of Samuel, Ne'eman, faithful. In the book of Psalms, we get Tzaddik, Chasid, Yashar, Ohev Torah, but we don't get Kadosh. We don't get holy. We get all of these different attributes, but we don't get holy. The only individual, the only thing, so we could just say as a conclusion, the Bible does not characterize righteous individuals as Kadosh. And you may have heard of Kedoshim, right? Likdoshim. It's a modern term to martyrs, right? For the 6 million Kedoshim. We call them Kedoshim, but that is a very, very modern use of the word Kadosh. The only exception really is the Kohen Gadol, and even then, the Kohen Gadol is referred to as Kadosh by what he wears. Vasita tzitz zahav ta'or, it's going to be in next week's parsha. Ufitachta alav pitu chochotev, you shall make a frontlet of pure gold and engrave on it the seal inscription Kodesh Ladonai. So the high priest is wearing a kind of turban, and on the turban there is a band of gold, and on the band of gold is the inscription Kodesh Ladonai, which indicates that this individual is Kodesh. What does that mean? So first, none of the patriarchs are kadosh. You might have expected with Abraham, and it's not even mentioned at Mount Moriah during the Akedah. You would think that that would be a kadosh place, but it's not. It's not regarded that way. Not at Bethel, not at the Yabok. Where do we find kadosh? We find it first instant at the burning bush, where God says to Moses, "Al tikrav halom, don't come near. Shal na'alecha me'al raglecha, take your shoes off. Ki hamakom asher ata omed alav admat kodesh. It is holy ground, or it is ground which is kodesh. Ground that is specified. Okay, and then you find it also in Joshua, the same kind of situation where God appears an angel appears to Joshua. A kind of repeat performance. Why should Joshua be left out of getting very, very important revelations? It's just not the same as Moses, let's face it. But you are standing on a place that is Kodesh. Okay? So the patriarchs are promised to be great, but not holy. And we have these instances of holy referring to specific places. The idea that we have a place where the bush is burned, the first major vision that Moses has, is hinting to us because of the relationship between the sneh, the bush, and Sinai, the mountain, and it's on that mountain where Moses sees the bush that God will appear to Israel. So that's what is making it Kodesh. Okay? Where do we have Kodesh in Breshit? One place, with regard to Shabbat. Okay, God blessed the seventh day and declared it holy, because on it God ceased from all work of creation that he had done. So the idea of holy is in Breshit does not refer to people, does not refer to places. We only get the first reference to a place in Exodus, but it does refer to time, specifically what time? Specifically to Shabbat. So Shabbat is never revealed to the patriarchs, contrary to what the rabbis or what later interpreters have said. They layer on the biblical tradition later practices. Abraham didn't keep kosher, as you know. Abraham did not observe the holidays. Abraham did not observe the Sabbath. No matter what we say, it's just not there. Okay, no evidence of that. But the first time Shabbat as a practice is mentioned to the people is after the Exodus, after the Red Sea, where they at the point where they receive the manna. Okay, what is kadosh? And I'll show you the text in a second. Kadosh is to be set aside, to be differentiated. It means to be totally set aside and differentiated. So the idea, again, it's like we think of gravity in one way. Our ancestor, people before Newton thought of gravity another way. We think of holy as in one thing. We have certain associations with it. But for a biblical individual or really someone in that world, holy is apart. And so God, as holy, is understood to be completely apart and differentiated from the world. That comes into a real conflict with contemporary notions of God in all religions, basically, that you can bring God. God is in us. Like when we say there's a spark of God in all of us, or that the Buberian notion, which is I and thou, behind every thou is the eternal thou. That in the space of a relationship you have the proximity of God. These are totally different ideas, as valid and as compelling as they are. The biblical idea is God is not a part of this world. God is apart from this world. And the best way to really understand it, as you've been hearing me say it, is like that God is this power separate from all reality that at one point wants to break through. And so the notion that there's a tremendous boundary between, God and the world, I think is really what is compelling to our biblical ancestors. They would not be able to relate to the idea that in Les Miserables, behind your, in your face, I see the face of God. They wouldn't be able to relate to that. God it's like there is a barrier, between God and human beings, but the barrier gets broken by God trying to convey God's will to the people. So that's what Kadosha. Kadosha is like completely separate. In the sense of separation and differentiation, God is the ultimate separate. So it's in that sense that Shabbat is completely walled off from the rest of, in terms of time. Shabbat, as structured in the Bible, is a boundary of time. We say this all the time, and it makes such abundant sense to us that Shabbat is a boundary. And of course, even today we commemorate Shabbat by doing boundary rituals as the time begins and boundary rituals as the time ends. The boundary ritual for the beginning of Shabbat is the lighting of candles, and the boundary ritual for the end of Shabbat is the lighting, the Havdalah, wine, spices, and a flame. The same way that, we'll talk about space boundaries in a second, but the analogy, stands that when you enter into a space, you cross through a zone, you cross a boundary to a zone. Talk about security boundaries, talk about national boundaries, talk about state boundaries. All of that applies here. I'm going to stop, get a drink of water, and see if you have any questions. Go ahead, Ilana.
So the root Kuf Shin Dalet, the root, the Shoresh, has another meaning. If you go to a different binyan, different conjugation, lehakdish is I don't know if to devote is the right translation into English. Lehakdish something, to devote something.
Absolutely.
Or to devote yourself to be holy.
Okay. So that is a modern Hebrew, but lahakdish in the biblical sense is, or pre-modern, would be to designate something and to make it separate for it. In other words, I would take my produce and I would separate it in order for it to be given and devoted to for the priest, etc. Right? Lahakdish, and what you're saying. So our contemporary notion of lahakdish is, look, I'm devoting myself to it, and that, of course, is our modern Hebrew elaboration of it, because the language itself develops, these various, very, very, rich layer of meanings around the idea of boundary and what you do with those boundaries. Go ahead, Bob.
And also Parashat Kedoshim. Parashat Kedoshim.
Okay, so we'll get to that. When we get to Kedoshim, we'll see that and it's an extrapolation. You'll see later in even this morning. Goy Kadosh means you are separate to me. Okay, that Israel, and this, of course, is very difficult for a modern person to understand, which is that you are separate. That Israel, in the biblical sense, is segregated to God. That by making Israel a separate entity to God with a separate mission, a separate purpose, right, is what it means to be Kedoshim. Okay, and as we will see, to have special rules and regulations that define those boundaries. Bob.
Does the Torah, or do you believe that speaks to different types of
I lost your last
boundaries, such as osmotic, porous, rigid boundaries? Pardon?
So we're chopped up here.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, now I can hear. Does the Torah does the Torah kind of think about different kinds of boundaries? Is that what I was saying? Different
Yes,
levels?
like osmotic, porous, or very rigid, fixed boundaries and things like that.
So what those boundaries, that kind of gradation doesn't exist, but gradations in terms of what's the most intense, what's zones of lesser and zones of more, and what are the boundaries that divide a sacred zone or a kadosh zone from a non-kadosh zone to the kadosh kodoshim. Those boundaries do exist, of course. Yeah, those we don't have the idea. I know what you're saying because obviously you're coming from the world of medicine. And yeah, there are certain kinds of cell walls that let stuff in, and certain kind of cell walls that don't. We don't have that notion. Of course, they don't have that idea from even in the microscopic level. Marlene.
Sounds like you're starting this conflagration of the people and Kodesh here at Har Sinai. What happened when they agreed to shech their lamb and leave the land of Mitzrayim?
Those are prior to this, okay? And it's a wonderful way of kind of entering this. There is no system that exists for them, and it's like it's their pre system. They don't have legislation. They don't have any set of rules, but they're going to get some. And so it's a kind of the Passover. What makes the Passover story and then its later commemoration so rich is that it really reflects something on a deep, and I would almost say primitive level. There's a primitive level to this.
But God reminds the people they're going to tell their children when the children ask, so that there's already some kind of an evolutionary, kind of like when you're cooking. So you get all of your ingredients and then you start to mix them, and they're in different stages until they're fully baked and finished. And here we are doing that. I don't understand how you can't have a continuum of separateness, because we started back some time ago when Abraham realized this entity of Hashem being one.
So we're moving through different kinds of stages here. The stage that we are talking about with the Exodus is a kind of vestibule stage. Sinai is where we want to get to. Sinai is where God is going to break through, okay? And that the covenant itself will be fully formed, as John said it earlier. That's where the meeting, I'm not sure it's the meeting of minds, but that's where the parties are going to come together and conjoin, basically. Prior to that, the Exodus through the Passover ritual, these are preparatory stages. The meal, I've always described the Passover meal as a covenantal meal that's mediated through family, that people are experiencing it on the family setting, that they are feeling that they are being joined, despite the fact that nowhere in the story there is it saying to them, at that point, it's not saying explicitly, you are going to be mine. God and Israel, you are going to be mine. It's, I will hear you, I will listen to you, I will save you in order for you to be mine. And that's a preparation for that, is this meal. And as I'm saying, what is so interesting about Passover, it feels like a primitive kind of celebration. It's a very basic. It's a roasted lamb. It's an unleavened bread. It's a bitter herb. And if that's that. I mean, I do a lot of research on this and look at this and think, primitive people still cook this way, eat this way. There's very minimal preparation for it. There's very minimal ingredients in it. The elaborate Seder that we have today is just like, no, it's not what it is. It's like, take a lamb, slaughter it, sprinkle its blood, eat it, roast it over fire, eat it with an unleavened bread, even with a leaf to give it some flavor or something, and that's a meal, right? And that kind of meal exists everywhere. And the Bible gives that meal the kind of foundational meaning that this is what it means to be part of the covenantal people. But the covenant doesn't have content until you get to Sinai. And Sinai is where the content, at least in its minimum form, exists with the 10 statements. That is, I am God, no other gods, don't take my name in vain, on the Sabbath, remember the Sabbath, etc., etc., etc. Okay? Go ahead.
Just a short one.
Yeah.
In a wedding, in a marriage, I think just before the groom breaks the glass, Harayat Mekudeshet li something.
Yes.
I don't remember which part of the ceremony it comes up, but Harayat Mekudeshet li. So it's for the wife to be devoted or to be holy for the husband.
Well, exactly. It means exactly she is separated from everyone else. Harayat Mekudeshet li.
But I own you now, in a way.
No, it doesn't mean I own you.
Okay.
It means I have made this relationship with you separate from my relationship with every single other person on the planet. Mikudeshet means you are distinct and separate. Now, the ring, we've often misinterpreted as an acquisition. The ring in legal terms is a consideration, so that even when you sign a contract today, a substance of value goes from one party to the next as, quote, a consideration of the legal status that has changed. Marlene?
And the word is used when you put on your tzitzit, your tefillin in the morning.
So saying, would it be what? Code.
Yes. It's in the...
That doesn't have Kodesh in there, but it's the same idea, right? Kodesh. Look, we have. Well, we'll see where we have the idea. We'll go on. Okay, here we go. There we go. All right. So the covenant, first time in Israel is called Kadosh is when they have the lead up to Mount Sinai, which we looked at a couple of weeks ago. In the Hebrew, it's Vayata'im Shemot Tishmu B'Koli V'Shmartem Et Briti. If you keep my covenant, V'yitem Li Skula Mikol Amim, you will be my treasured people. V'atem Tiyu Li Mamlechet Kohanim V'Goy Kadosh. You will be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, a Goy Kadosh. So what we're trying to say here is that the notion of Kadosh is almost coterminous with covenant. That covenant is a prerequisite for Kadosh, okay? In terms of people. The KEDUSHA of Israel stems from the fact that it has entered into a collective national covenant with God. So God, the people in the patriarchs, they're only individuals. So God has covenants with them, but they're only individuals. And therefore, because they're only individuals, they are not Kadosh. But Bnei Yisrael is an Am. And as a collective entity, that is the covenantal entity par excellence, and that becomes Kadosh, a Goy Kadosh. The nation has entered into a collective covenantal bond with God. It's a nation segregated for service of God through regulation. So, as we're going to see obviously later on in the Torah, it's filled with regulations, and that the service of God happens through the fulfillment of the regulation. The Kohen Gadol is Kodesh because the Kohen Gadol is the individual separated from the rest of the Kohanim and the rest of the people by the regulations, the unique regulations of service. Okay, there's nothing intrinsically better or more spiritual or more, exalted about the Kohen, other than the Kohen's genealogical status made him that way, and that he has a very segregated set of rules in order to fulfill and to reflect that relationship. So, despite and what we said before, with the Passover service, the meal and the Korban Pesach and the matzah, despite all of that, that is not yet holy, even though, I like to say that they're behaving, every head of household is behaving like a Kohen Gadol, every head of household is behaving in this way. It's it's like the dotted line before all of this. But it's only at Sinai where the people become known as a Goy Kadosh. And it's because of the covenant at Sinai, okay? And that is part of Israel's emergence as a nation. Kedusha implies dedication to God, expressed through regulation and restriction. It is a term that emerges only with the emergence of the Jewish people as a nation, and it only has meaning within the activities of its member. Kedusha, it applies to time, space, and to objects. And persons can all be endowed with Kedusha. Later on, yes, of course, the Kohen is Kadosh. But each of these realms has a hierarchy. The high priest versus the ordinary priest. Yom Kippur as the holiest day, as opposed to Shabbat and holidays. The Holy of Holies is the holiest of spaces. And Shabbat, the first entity that is endowed with Kedusha. So that emerges at the Red Sea, and we will see this. The first instruction of Shabbat is as follows. After the Red Sea, and this is where the manna is, God said to them, Hu asher diber, or Moses said, this is what God meant. Tomorrow is a day of rest. Shabbaton, Shabbat Kodesh LaDonai Machar, et asher tofu efu, et asher tivashlu bashelu, ve'et kol ha'odef inichu lahem lemishmeret ad haboker. So when they are being fed for the first time with the manna, that's when they get the instructions for Shabbat, that they are to behave in a certain way. And Shabbat only comes into existence after the Exodus. Shabbat becomes the preeminent symbol of the covenant. All right, so and we'll see this in a later parsha, but we know this from Vishamru, and we know it elsewhere here. V'atat daber al bnei Yisrael lemor, achet shabtotai tishmoru, together with all the instructions about the tabernacle that we are seeing in this week's parsha, next week's parsha. Keep the Sabbaths. Ot hi beini uvenichem ledorotechem. It will be a sign throughout the ages. Ladat ki ani Adonai mikadishchem. That I am the Lord who separates you, who consecrates you, who makes you, and is separated. So you'll keep the Sabbath. Ushmartem et Shabbat ki kodesh hilachem. It is separate for you. V'chalalei mot yumat. Desecrators will be put to death. Put those who do work. V'nichrata nefesh ha'imikera b'ma. So it has unique penalties if you violate the Shabbat in the biblical realm. Right? The unique penalty is that you will be set aside. You even will incur the death penalty. Sheshet yamim yaseh malacha v'yom hashvi Shabbat Shabbaton kodesh l'Adonai. It's holy to God. Kol ha'aseh malacha v'yom Shabbat mot yumat. And then b'sha'amru v'nei Yisrael et ha'Shabbat lasot et berit olam. So the Shabbat is a sign of the covenant, which is fascinating, which we're not always mindful of. That we think of circumcision as a sign of the covenant. Okay, however that gets translated to us, we think of, but Shabbat, since it's an abstraction in the sense that it's an experience in time, we don't think of the abstract in symbolic terms, that is in physical terms, but it's that you could say that keeping Shabbat is a way of keeping the covenant. It requires a bit of a mental leap. It's not a difficult one. I can certainly think abstractly about time, I have, that if I celebrate a birthday, that's a celebration of time. And so, a celebration of a birthday is a symbolic statement of, whoever's birthday it is, right? So it's a connection. I celebrate Shabbat by making it distinct, and that becomes a way of designating and demarcating and demonstrating the relationship. So the celebration of time is a celebration of relationship, just like you would say, okay, a birthday or like an anniversary. An anniversary, sometimes you get an anniversary present, but when you designate the anniversary with a special meal or a special kind of celebration, never mind a present, and you're marking the time, it's really a way of reflecting on the relationship. Time has that way. When you designate time in such a way, you are speaking symbolically of your relationship to whatever it is that you are designating. Okay, so the Shabbat then becomes the covenant through a symbol in time. Shabbat as a symbol of time. The tablets are the symbol of the covenant in an object, right? And the sanctuary, which is the subject of our Parsha, is the symbol of the covenant in space. Or I would say it in this way, it's the spatial representation of the covenant. And this, I think, is going to be the most interesting concept of today. You may have heard it before, I've touched on it in the past, but the sanctuary represents the covenant in the sense that it's a representation of Sinai. The sanctuary, as we'll see, becomes the portable Sinai. But Shabbat, the apex of holiness in the realm of time, the sanctuary is the apex of holiness in the realm of space. And I think that this kind of helps us frame our understanding of Judaism, at least in the Bible, that the institution of Shabbat is time. And so we live very much in time, but we also live in space. And that is our spatial understanding, that is to say, our understanding of the object place in our lives, so that there is a special place for that is designated apart from every other place. And that was the sanctuary. What's located at the apex of the sanctuary? Well, the Ark of the Covenant, the box containing the tablets, which is the testimony of the covenant. So there's a system here. The system here is that the space has zones in it, and the zone that is the holiest zone has a holy object in it, and in the holy object is the object which represents the relationship between God and the people. The tablets are the symbol of the covenant. So if I have an abstract symbol of the covenant, which is Sabbath, that is time, I have a spatial representation of the covenant, which is the sanctuary, and I have an object representation of the covenant, which is the stones of the tablets. All of this is linked. Shabbat is linked as a symbol with covenant in time, and MIKDASH is a symbol of a covenant in space. Now, it's important to understand something, that and that's a telemarketer, sorry, that we commemorate the Exodus and Sinai in two different ways. This is really, really important, okay? We commemorate the Exodus on the calendar. We commemorate through the Seder, as we've spoken about. It's an annual event. Every year on Passover, 14th of Nisan, 15th, we commemorate the anniversary of our liberation. We reenact the event by making a Seder, and we reenact the event by telling the story. We eat, or we commemorate the eating of the Paschal Lamb. All right? But you will, and we have other rituals throughout the year, at least in the Torah, where the commemoration of the Exodus is evoked, namely the bringing of first fruits, the wearing of tefillin, Shabbat, etc. But while the Torah is replete with commandments and exhortations concerning the Exodus and the commemoration of its anniversary, the opposite is true concerning its approach to the revelation at Sinai. Nowhere does the Bible state the date of the theophany. This might be new for people to understand, but the Torah never tells us what the date of Mount Sinai was. We may think of it as the 6th of Sivan, but it doesn't say so. You remember when we were talking about this a couple of weeks ago, and Marlene, you did ask this question, on the third new moon after the Israelites had gone forth from the land of Egypt, on that very day they entered the wilderness of Sinai. So what does that mean? We don't know what it means, right? You say, I said it's Rosh Chodesh, right? And we can twist ourselves into a pretzel trying to make it correspond to Shavuot, but it doesn't. There's no connection between Shavuot and Revelation in the Torah. Okay, it's not explicitly mentioned. There's no single commandment in the Torah whose express purpose is to commemorate the giving of the law at Sinai. This is different from our contemporary understanding in Judaism, because we so definitely associate Shavuot with the giving of the Torah, but nowhere in the Torah is that explicit. It's not explicit, and there are reasons for that, which we'll get into in a second. There's no anniversary or no commemoration. It's not historically bound. It's meta-historical, and it's intended to be that way. So Shabbat is historical, and in the sense that it's a regular historical commemoration of Exodus. Pesach is a regular anniversary of the Exodus, the same way that an Independence Day would be a regular commemoration of your national independence. But the commemoration of God breaking through to humanity is not an annualized event, at least in the Torah. It is meta-historical. It is beyond history. In other words, it's to be understood at all times. That is to say, God's voice speaking is to be constantly heard, and it's not restricted to a single event that is commemorated, or a single set of events. So here's my parenthesis, though. Why did Shavuot become the day of Matantora? Because the temple was destroyed, and the people were exiled. They could no longer perform the pilgrimage. So Sinai, Shavuot emerges already in rabbinic times as the celebration of the giving of the Torah, for a practical reason, which is that there was no longer a place that was connected to the pilgrimage, and there was no longer a place that was connected to the original meaning of Shavuot, which probably had more to do with the manna in the desert than anything else. And that's complicated. It's a different story. But go ahead, John, you have a question.
Not a question, just a comment. I think the intellectual sophistication of the biblical writer is amazing.
Yes.
When you're talking about Sinai being meta-historical, that analysis is very sophisticated, I think.
So it is an analysis, but it's like to a person who is not sophisticated, you would say as follows. Okay, so what do you have? I have space. I'm almost saying, it's sophisticated, but it's also, there's a primitive understanding of Sinai, because it's reflected. The point I'm getting to is that it's going to be reflected in the actual space of the sanctuary. In other words, if you are a simple biblical Jew, right, and you happen to be walking by the sanctuary, your immediate association is to Sinai, right? You see it there as a distinct place, and your experience is that, you're standing there with your little child, and the child says, "What's that?" And you say, "That is the sanctuary," and we understand that that's a representation of, that represents where God speaks to Moses, okay, and that represents where God's covenant exists. Oh, that's really interesting. Now that's a very primitive, that's not sophisticated. That's a very primitive understanding.
Very.
What becomes sophisticated is that, look, we look all, from our point of view, what are they trying to do? They're trying to sever that from an actual place and make the place kind of radiate constantly through the people as a kind of echo of science. It's almost like saying, we have the Big Bang. The Big Bang is if you have a powerful telescope, you can hear the radiation. So the analogy really stands. We the sanctuary/temple is the receptacle for the echo of the Big Bang, the revelation. Whose hand was first? Marlene? Go ahead.
The Shavuot is indicated by the counting of the days and the weeks.
Correct.
So that you're looking forward to experiencing something that you can't do without the help of God. You can plant the seeds and water them and pull the weeds, but God makes it grow. So here the first fruits are that concept of a relationship with God, but it also evens out the year for holidays so that you don't have all of them bunched over here and then nothing.
Well, so it's interesting because Shavuot is only 7 weeks after Pesach, so it's kind of bunched over there. But we do have our holidays bunched in 2 quadrants of the year. In other words, 7 months apart, basically. Yes, Bob.
You may or may not come to this question later, but you often say if you were staging something,
yes,
what would people be thinking and feeling as they're getting these instructions and being told to create the Mishkan?
Sure.
So for the common people, are they thinking in these abstract ways, or what do you think might be going through their heads?
Such a great question, and we'll get to that. So the answer is they're probably thinking the way that a common person thinks of when they enter into a sacred space. I'm gonna go to that point here because I think we get the point that it's a portable Sinai, that the sanctuary is perpetuating the Sinai experience, and this will always allow people to approach God in covenantal closeness. But I want to do an aside here, which is exactly you're following up on your question here. What do you experience when you enter sacred structures? You really are going to experience a narrative. I think, we people who are so detached from the religious experience, at least in a cultural sense, we don't know what it means. If you talk to a devout Catholic about going into a church or a basilica or a cathedral, I'm not sure if they get it, but people who are, it's not, I don't think you need to be very sophisticated to get it, but their experience is, I am walking into the body of Christ. The church is a story. The basilica, the cathedral is a story. Certainly the great cathedrals in the world, Notre Dame, the St. Peter's, they're all structured in a very, very common way. That is, there's an axis, a northwest axis and an east-west, and that's the cross. They're coming in. They say it's the body of Christ, okay? And so when the worshiper comes into the cathedral, the worshiper is totally having this experience of sharing in the life, the body of Christ, in all of the ramifications that means, okay? So I can't stress this enough. It's a profound narrative for the religious pilgrim, for the religious Christian. The entry into the sacred basilica requires a preparation. So you see this in Catholicism, right? You enter, you cross yourself, you put the holy water on yourself. These are boundary rituals that are relating to the deepest story within the worshiper's life. That is, I'm coming to a sacred zone and I'm coming into a story. Okay, for the I'm not I'm not familiar, elementary with enough of Islam, but just if you just Google this and ask what does a Muslim feel when they go into a mosque? So a mosque is could be a very simple or ornate place, but there is a story that is being told through the Quran and through the religious experience of the Muslim worshiper, that they are coming into contact with a kind of the origins of Islam. That is, to say that this is the first mosque was Muhammad's courtyard, and so they're coming into that story. They're coming into that story, and they're coming into contact with God, who had made contact with Muhammad in, I guess, confined area. Okay, and then of course it's a place of assembly. It's a place of worship, a prayer hall that is organized towards Mecca, that has a certain set of structures. The minaret also has the call to prayer, and all of these things tell a story. So what is it about the temple? If you went to the temple as a pilgrim during the time when the first or second temple stood, you were not going there to study Torah. You were not going there. You were going to present sacrifices, but you were going to experience the covenant. You were going to experience the conjoining of God and the people. Now, our problem is when the temple is destroyed, what comes to represent that? Well, we don't have that anymore. We don't have what people came to the temple for was atonement and for honor and for sacrifice and all that, but we don't have that. It all got mediated now through Torah and the study of Torah. We come to the synagogue, and we're telling a story of the desert. Throughout everything that we're doing, we're telling the story of the desert, and we have it's all kind of mishmashed, right? And the most important element of the narrative for the worshiper coming into the synagogue is what? The community. The community is the possessor of the covenant. It's interesting that if you go to shuls, of course we have all of our ritual elements in the shul, but the Yortzeit board, to me, is one of the most significant elements of the shul. And I'm not sure that you have an equivalent in Christian churches, Catholic or Protestant, where so many people are inside the sanctuary. But the fact that I come into the sanctuary and I see all the religious symbols, and I also see names of people, is an important. It's not subliminal. It's right in front of you. It's people. I'm coming into the community. And that's what we always say. What the synagogue represents more than anything today, I think, is the story of the community and the perpetuation of the people of Israel. So what I'm saying is that the sanctuary tells an early stage of a story, which is Sinai. I don't walk into the synagogue necessarily thinking of Sinai, although I have Sinai elements in the synagogue. The bima is a Sinai. The ark is the ark, okay? But it's mostly the desert, and it's mostly the people. I'm coming in to be telling the story of the people of Israel. For Christians, it's the body of Christ. For Islam, for Muslims, it's to be part of the life of. Well, and again, I don't know enough of Buddhism and Hinduism, but they have their own stories that they're telling through the symbols in their sacred spaces. Okay, we're almost out of time, but the ark is really the place where that meaning takes place. The ark is defined in our parsha. What does the ark look like? And what is the ark for? V'no'adati lecha sham v'dibarti itcha mik'ala kaporet. That's the place of meeting. The meeting on top of the Aron Ha'idut, the Ark of Testimony. So the Ark represents the place where God will meet Moses and meet the people, and it's in the Ark that you have the testimony. It's a representation of revelation. It's the receptacle of the voice from Sinai. Okay, and here is the schematic representation. I think it's pretty much this clear, okay? The mountain consists of the foot of the mountain, the middle of the mountain, and the top of the mountain. Who gets to be on the top of the mountain? Moses. Who got to be on the middle of the mountain? The elders. Who is at the base? The rest of us. The tabernacle, who gets to go into the Holy of Holies? The Kohen Gadol. Who gets to be over here? Only the Kohanim. And who gets to be here? The people. So the tabernacle becomes the two-dimensional representation of the three-dimensional mountain. And the other thing about the tabernacle is when you want to move, you take it down and you move. So you're like moving the mountain with you, except for the fact that it would be very, very difficult to move a mountain, but it's easy to move. It's easier theoretically to move the sanctuary. The point is, the Bible has a big problem, which is if God only appears to us one place, how do we keep God with us? Well, we take him with us. We take the representation with us. Now you can see how problematic that is because it invests in space, things that are beyond representation. But the people need this, and this is going to be the tension that plays itself out. We need this kind of representation, and we need this kind of proximity. But the paradox of this proximity is that, Sinai was only a one-time event, and what it comes after, who knows? Okay. All right. So I'll skip through this whole explanation. Basically, it says all the things that I'm saying here. This corresponds to this. This corresponds to this. This corresponds to this. The top, the Holy of Holies, etc. Bottom line is that we have different zones. Just as Moses alone may ascend the peak of the mountain, so all but one are barred from the Holy of Holies, etc., etc. The graduated restrictions on access, touch, and sight are the counterparts of the repeated regulations about the unlawful invasion of the sacred domain in the three ways. Okay. So my last question, really, and this is how we end it, which is, so all of this is very well and good for the Bible, but how do we ourselves encounter God, right? And this, the difficulty that a modern person has in reading this is that, on the one hand, we want those experiences. I don't know if we envy our ancestors for having that proximity, but we almost say, like, why can't we do that? Why can't we have some of that?
I don't want that.
But we're in a different world altogether. And so we have to think of these things in both temporal and spatial categories that are completely different from our ancestors. But the basic ideas, I think, are there, which is covenant, sacred zones in terms of both temporal zones and spatial zones, less so objects, although all of us would accord the scroll as in the status of the holiest of objects. In other words, we treat it a certain way. We fast if we drop it, God, and all of that. We relate to it with a certain degree of reverence. That's probably the only vestige of that feeling, the terror that a worshiper gets. And I've been through this, so I understand this. If a Torah falls out of the ark or falls from the table, that terror, and we even say, God forbid, the terror of that is very real. And that moment of irrational feeling of fear and terror comes close to the feeling that people had in antiquity. I'll stop there and get some questions. John and then Bob.
Well, the question was, how do we see God? I know that Heschel talks about what he calls radical amazement. So all of a sudden, out of nowhere, you perceive something and you have this otherworldly experience.
And you don't need space.
So what you're saying is that it's what Heschel was aspiring to, and this is really part of the discussion about Heschel, is did Heschel see himself in that prophetic way? He understood these categories better than most people. And did he aspire to that in his own way? And the people that studied with him, really thought of him as someone who either tried to, but understood that he couldn't. But the point is, even Heschel says in God in Search of Man that there's a difference between a process and an event, that Sinai was an event, and that Sinai was unique, and that the echoes of it continue. Yeah. Bob, go ahead.
Just three brief comments, because I think also you're asking the question, how do we encounter or in fact produce holiness?
Yeah.
And not just God. The late Chief Rabbi Sachs talked about the fact that God has been doing everything for the Israelites up until now, and now through the construction of the Mishkan, now we are in the process of creating things and doing things and bringing Hashem to earth. And so the question is, how do we co-create holiness rather than saying this is a holy spot and this and that? We actually are bringing it in through the process. That's comment one.
Yeah.
Comment two was a very interesting thing about, I read that the menorah can also be seen as having the mixture of time and space and the people, with the central candle representing Shabbat, and the days, the three candles on either side being Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, as well as the central candle being, if you will, the Torah, and then the 6 tractates of the Mishnah around it. So playing with actual objects within the Mishkan as doing it. And then the final piece is, again, I think from the Hasidic perspective, the issue of the tabernacle in oneself, in one's own heart and body, which people.
Sure. So what basically I put all three comments into one kind of category, which is, what we're dealing with is the rich array of symbols. And Rabbi Sachs was certainly onto something when he said, look, that Sinai represents a transition point from instruction to doing, and that it's the beginning of doing. It evokes the fact that God and holiness is not an abstraction, but it's done through righteous behavior. Okay, and that's certainly going to be a theme that comes on in much later in the book of Vayikra. In terms of the symbology of things like the menorah, yeah, I mean the sky's the limit. I mean, both of those sets of symbols that you mentioned are very compelling. The 6 days of the week and the 7th day, very, very, very good. 7, of course, being an organizing number for everything in the Torah. I would doubt that it's, maybe the rabbis are kind of, retrojecting the organization of the Mishnah onto the menorah. That would be, my little take on that. But what it means is that a rich symbol can give you many, many different meanings. And there's no reason why any of them can't be valid if they suggest something in you, for sure. And of course, the Kabbalistic idea that the Mishkan is inside you. Yeah, when the Mishkan ceases to be a thing in existence, an actual physical thing, and all you have is an imagination, and all you have is a text, the sky is the limit, and the mystical apprehension of what the space, meditation on that, what does the mystic want? The mystic wants to enter the Holy of Holies, right? The mystic wants to be the Kohen Gadol. We have this lovely meditation that we say on Yom Kippur prior to the Avodah service, which is, it's just a spellbinding meditation that kind of lays everything out in all its detail. There was there's one calendar, on the holy days of the calendar are the Shabbats, and the holiest of Shabbat is Yom Kippur, and there's one land, and it's the land of Israel. It's a holy land, and there's a holy city in the holy land, and there's a holy place in the holy land, and there's a holy place in the holy place, and that's the Holy of Holies. And there's one individual, there's one people, and there's one group, the Kohanim, and there's one person among the Kohanim, and on the holiest day, the holiest person enters the holiest zone, and we have a kind of, an alignment of all of that. Well, that's just spellbinding as a mystical meditation, because all it says, basically, if you're taking your worship very seriously, it's saying, what am I doing now? I'm revving up my voltage in my soul so that I can line all my iron filings in one way, right? I'm aligning with the principle that there's a holiest source in the world, and that while I'm not in the temple, I can be in a temple now. And while I'm not the Kohen Gadol, I can for a moment imagine myself. And all of that That's a very powerful religious experience. We say that every Yom Kippur. I think it's very, very compelling. It's a good point. Go ahead, Ilana.
I have a question about the kruvim.
Yeah.
I don't understand it.
Most of us don't, but we should probably examine it. The kruvim it's a creature, winged creature, wings, body of a lion, face of a human being. It all kind of comes together in that way, and some scholars look at it and say this is the borrowing of other motifs, a powerful motif like that. But I'll leave that for another time, I guess. All right, folks.
Also the Kedusha in the Tefillah, in the Amidah, Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. Okay, just a reminder.
It's such a powerful moment, and here this will make it's the mitzamrer. Okay, this will make you the Kedusha in the Amidah is the representation in words of entering the Holy of Holies. Okay, and it's the idea that while we don't have a Holy of Holies and we don't have a temple and we approach all of this by saying the words. And so for the moment that we're standing in the Kedusha, we are pretending that we are in that holy zone. And then we could exit. So it's, in other words, we're saying it's not a Yom Kippur moment, but it's saying we are aware of it. And therefore, by coming into that awareness, we are coming into the sanctuary in that way. It's through words, we're making a pilgrimage. I think it's a stunning idea. Okay. All right, everyone.